Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're going way back early America and looking at how one election, the election of 1800, cast a shadow over the Supreme Court for decades to come.
It's really something how much impact just one election had on the highest court in the land.
Yeah, right. Like we have a stack of Supreme Court cases here, all
Yeah.
tied back to this one event, and it looks like we're going to be in for a wild ride seeing how it shaped American law and government.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people might be surprised by that. We tend to think of presidents and Congress as the big players, but the courts are where so much of this power struggle really gets hammered out.
Okay, so for our listener who might not be as familiar with this period, let's set the stage. The election of 1800, it's been called a revolution, but a peaceful one. What
Mhm.
made it so momentous?
Well, this was truly the first time in U.S. history that power changed hands between opposing political parties peacefully.
Mm.
The Federalists, led by John Adams, they were all about a strong central government.
Right, the big government types.
Exactly. And they'd been in charge for a while, but then you have the Democratic Republicans coming up, led by Thomas Jefferson, and they're pushing for states' rights, less power in the hands of the federal government.
So two very different visions for what America should be. Like, what were the core values driving this conflict? Because it wasn't just about how much power the federal government should have, right? There were deeper philosophical differences at play, weren't there?
Oh, absolutely. It was about individual liberty, economic policy, foreign relations, all sorts of things.
Yeah.
The Federalists, for instance, they lean towards a more industrial, commercially driven economy, factories, trade, big business.
Okay, so kind of like the Hamilton vision.
Yeah, exactly. While the Democratic Republicans, they favored an agrarian society, farmers' land ownership, less government interference in the economy.
So then Jefferson wins. Everyone thinks, all right, new era, time for the Federalists to pack it up. But this is where the ghost idea comes in, right? Like,
Right.
things aren't quite that simple.
Not quite. So before leaving office, the Federalists, they made a whole bunch of judicial appointments. They stacked the courts with their people.
Kind of like a last-minute power play.
Yeah, you could see it that way. And this move, it had huge implications down the line.
Yeah.
Even though they lost the presidency, they still had a lot of control over the judiciary.
Okay. I see where this is going. So even though Jefferson's in office, these Federalist judges are still around making decisions. Did that immediately cause friction with his administration?
Absolutely. Right out of the gate, we have the case of United States v. Thomas Cooper. This guy Cooper, he criticizes President Adams in public,
Yeah.
speaks out against him. And the Federalists, they use the Sedition Act to silence him.
Whoa, hold on. The Sedition Act, that's that law that made it illegal to criticize the government, right?
Yeah, basically. And it was super controversial even back then. People saw it as a way for the Federalists to shut down anyone who disagreed with them.
So much for freedom of speech, huh? This Thomas Cooper case really shows how tense things were. But then Jefferson's in office, the Sedition Act expires, and you'd think things would calm down, right?
Well, not exactly, because just 3 years later, we get Marbury v. Madison. This one's a landmark case for a reason. It's where the idea of judicial review gets established.
Right, judicial review.
Right.
That's the power of the Supreme Court to say, hey, this law is unconstitutional. But how does this tie back to the 1800 election and all that drama?
Okay, so before leaving office, Adams, he tries to pack the courts with even more Federalist judges. Those midnight appointments you might have heard about.
Oh, yeah, right before midnight on his last day in office.
Exactly. So William Marbury, he was one of these appointees,
Yeah.
but his official paperwork didn't get delivered in time, so he sued.
Ah, so this is where John Marshall steps in, a Federalist appointed by Adams. It's like legal chess at this point.
It really is. So Marshall, he's the Chief Justice, and he sees an opportunity. Here's what he does. He denies Marbury his commission, seemingly siding with Jefferson.
So it looks like he's giving Jefferson the win.
Right. But here's the twist. In the process of doing that, he establishes the principle of judicial review. He basically gives the Supreme Court this huge GG power to check the other branches of government.
Whoa, that's sneaky. So the Federalists lose the election, but they gain this tool that shapes American law forever. I mean, this is like setting up a legal system where your side can win even when you lose an election. It's wild.
Yeah, and that's what makes this era so fascinating. The groundwork's being laid for this ongoing tension between federal power and states' rights, a debate that continues even today.
Now, that tension, it plays out in some interesting ways in the cases that follow. We've got Fletcher v. Peck in 1810. What's the deal with this one?
All right, so this is where the Supreme Court overturns a state law for the first time ever. It involved land speculation in Georgia. The details are kind of messy.
Yeah, I skimmed through that one. It's a lot.
But here's the key takeaway. The court basically says contracts are sacred. Even if a state legislature tries to undo a deal, the Constitution protects those agreements.
So this would have had huge implications for businesses, right? Saying the government can't just come in and change the rules of the game whenever they feel like it.
Absolutely. This was a big win for property rights and economic stability. It showed that the Supreme Court, still influenced by those Federalist ideas, was going to be a major player in protecting individual economic interests, even against state legislatures.
Which is a very Federalist stance. So even with Jefferson as president, those ideas are still having an impact. This really drives home the whole ghost idea.
And it doesn't stop there. Just a few years later, in 1816, we have Martin v. Hunter's lessee. This case establishes the Supreme Court's power to review decisions made by state courts. So it's like saying, hey, when it comes to the Constitution, we have the final say.
Okay, now that must have driven the Jeffersonians crazy. It's a direct attack on their vision of a more decentralized government. How did they react to this?
You can imagine the outrage. This was a major blow to their whole philosophy. But again, we see John Marshall still running the Supreme Court, reaffirming the Federalist vision of a strong, unified nation under the Constitution.
And speaking of Federalist visions, we got to talk about McCulloch v. Maryland. This is the big showdown over the second bank of the United States, right? This one feels like it goes right to the heart of this whole debate about federal power and the legacy of 1800. What happened here?
All right, this is where it gets really interesting. And remember, Alexander Hamilton, the Federalist finance whiz.
Oh, yeah, he was all about that national bank.
Exactly. He'd pushed for it, and the Floyd Bank had existed, but it wasn't renewed. Then comes the second bank, and Jefferson and his allies. They hate it.
Yeah.
They see it as this massive overreach of federal power,
Yeah.
Favoring the wealthy elite over the common man.
So it's the Federalists' vision for a centralized financial system versus the Jeffersonian ideal of limited government and agrarian values. It sounds epic.
It was. And the amazing thing is the Supreme Court, in a 7-0 decision, they side with the bank. This is seen as a huge victory for that Federalist idea of implied powers, even though by this point the Federalist Party itself is pretty much gone.
Wait, so even though the party's dead, their ideas are alive and well, thanks to the court, they helped shape it. That's incredible.
It really is. And it sets the stage for decades of legal and political battles over the balance of power between the states and the federal government.
Yeah.
The legacy of the election of 1800, it's woven into American law, and it still influences how we understand our nation today.
All right, so we've seen how this battle between Federalist and Democratic Republican ideas is playing out in the Supreme Court even after that crazy election of 1800. But we're moving into the 1820s now and beyond. I'm guessing things get even more complicated, right? New issues pop up, the political landscape shifts. How does this ghost of 1800 keep influencing things?
It's wild how much these early decisions echo through time. In the 1820s, you have Cohen's v. Virginia.
That's the one about lottery tickets, right? I remember seeing that on the list.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
On the surface, it seems pretty mundane, but underneath, it's the Supreme Court, again, asserting its authority. They're basically saying, we have the final say on what the Constitution means, even if the states disagree.
So it's kind of like a continuation of Martin v. Hunter's lessee, that idea of federal power over the states.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating to see how John Marshall's, a figure so shaped by those early 1800s politics is driving so much of this. It really shows you how one person in the right position can have a huge impact on the legal landscape.
Now, looking ahead, I see one case, Worcester v. Georgia, that seems particularly significant. It deals with Native American rights, which adds a whole other layer of complexity to this story. What went down here?
Well, this case is pivotal.
Yeah.
And honestly, pretty tragic. So the Cherokee Nation was in Georgia, and the state was trying to regulate their land,
Right.
Basically exert control over them.
Which seems like a violation of tribal sovereignty.
Yeah, and the Supreme Court under Marshall, they agreed. They said, nope, only the federal government has that power.
Yeah.
It was a big step towards recognizing the sovereignty of Native American tribes.
Which sounds like a huge win for tribal rights. But I have a feeling it didn't exactly go over well with everyone.
Sadly, you're right. This is where we see the limits of the court's power. Andrew Jackson, he was president at the time, a big believer in states' rights, and he basically ignores the ruling.
He just says no thanks.
Pretty much. He refuses to enforce it, and this leads directly to the forced removal of the Cherokee, the Trail of Tears.
So even though the Supreme Court made this landmark decision, the reality on the ground was very different. It's a reminder that legal victories don't always equal immediate change, especially when you're dealing with deep-seated prejudices and power imbalances.
Absolutely. And it brings us to the 1840s, where slavery becomes the dominant issue.
Yeah.
And all those questions we've been talking about, federal power, states, rights, individual liberty, they all get filtered through this incredibly divisive lens.
This is where things get really tangled, right? Like the old Federalist versus Democratic Republican lines start to blur. It seems like the issue of slavery really throws everything up in the air. How does this impact the Supreme Court?
The case that really highlights this shift is Prague v. Pennsylvania. It centers around the Fugitive Slave Act, a federal law that forced states to return escaped slaves to their owners.
But so hold on. Pennsylvania, they were trying to protect escaped slaves, right? And the court said they couldn't.
Yeah. The Supreme Court struck down those state laws. They said the federal law was supreme.
But wait, isn't that a complete reversal? I thought the Democratic Republicans were all about states' rights. How did they end up advocating for strong federal power when it came to something as awful as slavery?
It's a fascinating and troubling twist.
Hmm.
By the 1840s, the pro-slavery wing of the Democratic Party, they had a lot of power. And they realized that to keep slavery going, they needed a strong federal government to overrule any states trying to interfere.
So the very principles that were once used to limit federal power are now being used to expand it all to enforce something that so many people saw as morally wrong. It's a stark reminder that legal principles can be used in drastically different ways depending on who's in charge and what they want to achieve.
Exactly. And this raises a question. What does this mean for how we understand the election of 1800 and its legacy? We see these echoes, but they're distorted, almost unrecognizable at times.
It's like looking into one of those funhouse mirrors. You can still see the basic shapes, but they're all twisted and warped. It challenges us to think critically about how political power shifts, how legal principles can be manipulated, and how even the most significant events can have really complicated and contradictory legacies.
You got it. It's not a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It's messy and nuanced and often unsettling. It forces us to confront these contradictions that are at the very core of American history.
And I think that's what makes this deep dive so valuable for our listeners. It's not just about knowing the names of cases or legal theories. It's about seeing how history shapes us today, how legal principles can be both tools for justice and instruments of oppression, and how our understanding of the past is always changing.
It is. And ultimately, it's about recognizing that these big questions raised by these early Supreme Court cases, questions about federal powers, states' rights, individual liberty, and the role of the courts, they're still with us today. They shape our politics and influence the legal battles that are happening right now.
So as we head into the final part of our deep dive, I think it's important to keep that in mind. We're not just exploring some dusty old history. We're grappling with issues that are relevant to our lives right now. All right, so listener, we've made it. We've gone through decades of early American history and seen how the election of 1800 had this ripple effect on the Supreme Court. I mean, it's been a wild ride with all these twists and turns and unexpected connections. As we wrap up, what are some of the biggest things you think our listeners should walk away with?
You know what really stands out to me? It's how much we focus on presidents. Like we think of them as the big movers and shakers. But this deep dive, it really highlights the judiciary. They're the ones making these long-term changes. It's not so much about the day-to-day politics. It's about setting these precedents that echo through time.
Right, like planting a seed that grows into this massive tree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we saw that firsthand with John Marshall, appointed right before Jefferson takes office. And he becomes this incredibly influential figure. He's like the embodiment of that Federalist ghost shaping the court for over 3 decades.
It's kind of mind-blowing how one person can have such a lasting impact.
It really is. And the cases we talked about, Marbury, Fletcher, McCulloch, these weren't just abstract legal decisions. They were about power. You know, they set the stage for how America would function as a nation.
But then things get even crazier when we hit the mid-1800s. The slavery issue explodes, and it's like all the old rules go out the window. What was once a debate about the size of government becomes this tool to prop up something truly horrific.
And that's the disturbing part.
Yeah.
Legal principles, even ones designed to protect liberty, can be twisted to serve really dark purposes. The Fugitive Slave Act being upheld by the Supreme Court, that's a chilling example. It shows how the legacy of an event can be so complex and disturbing.
It's a reminder that history isn't always a feel-good story. You know, it's full of these contradictions and compromises and sometimes outright injustices. It's not about simplifying the past. It's about wrestling with it.
I agree completely. That struggle, that's what I hope our listener takes away from this. The election of 1800 might seem like ancient history, but it's still relevant. The questions it raised about federal powers, states' rights, individual liberty, the role of the courts, we're still grappling with those today.
So it's not just about understanding the past, it's about using that understanding to navigate the present.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most important things we can do. As citizens, as informed individuals, we need to be aware of these historical forces that are still shaping our world.
Absolutely. So, listener, as you go about your day, think about this. When you hear about a Supreme Court case, don't just focus on the immediate outcome. Think about the bigger picture. You know, the historical context, the echoes of past struggles, the potential consequences, whether they're intended or not.
That's how we become more engaged and informed citizens. By understanding how we got here, we can make better decisions about where we go next.
Well said. So keep diving deep, keep asking questions, keep making those connections, because that's how we make sense of this big, messy, complicated world we live in.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.